The morning my father was buried, the sky over the valley was the color of wet cement. I stood at the edge of the cemetery in my only good shirt, the one with the frayed collar I kept ironing because I couldn't afford another, and watched them lower him into the ground. There weren't many people, a few neighbors, old Mrs. Harmon from the feed store, a couple of men who used to work the fields with Dad before his back gave out. My cousin Derek stood near his black Audi, scrolling through his phone, waiting for it to be over. I didn't cry, not because I didn't want to. I just didn't have anything left. My name is Ethan Miller, and at 31 years old, I was the last person anyone expected to keep a farm alive. The farm was 400 acres of flat black earth in the heart of the valley, corn, soybeans, and winter wheat when the weather cooperated. My great-grandfather had cleared the first fields with a team of horses in 1923. 4 generations of millers had planted, harvested, cursed the rain or prayed for it, buried their dead in the cemetery on the hill, and kept going. Now it was just me, and I was losing. The debts had started piling up when Dad got sick 2 years before he died. Medical bills, equipment repairs we couldn't afford, a drought that cut our yield by 40%. I was working 18-hour days, fixing fences at dawn, running the planter alone, hauling grain to the elevator in a truck that burned oil and shook at anything over 55. My hands were cracked and stained. My boots had holes I covered with duct tape. I ate canned soup for dinner most nights and fell asleep in the recliner with the TV on because the silence of the house was worse than any noise. Nobody in the family offered to help. Not once. The reading of the will took place 4 days later in the back office of Harrison and Associates on Main Street. The room smelled like old paper and floor polish. There was a ceiling fan that wobbled with every rotation, and a framed photograph of the county courthouse from 1947 hanging crooked on the wall. Mr. Harrison sat behind his desk with a manila folder, looking at all of us over the top of his reading glasses. Derek was there with his wife, Lisa. My Aunt Patricia drove in from Kansas City in a rental car that probably cost more per day than my grocery bill for a week. She wore a gray silk blouse and pearl earrings that caught the fluorescent light every time she turned her head. My Uncle Gene sat beside her, arms crossed, his gold watch glinting beneath the cuff of his navy blazer. They all sat in the front row of chairs, like they were at a board meeting, backs straight, eyes sharp, ready to collect what they believed was owed to them. I sat in the back, near the door, with diesel grease still under my fingernails from trying to fix the irrigation pump that morning. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "Robert Miller's estate is straightforward," he said. "The farmhouse and primary. Residents go to Ethan Miller as sole occupant and operator of the property." Patricia shifted in her chair. Derek looked up from his phone. "The 40-acre parcel along Route 9 is to be divided equally among Patricia Grant, Gene Miller, and Derek Miller." That got nods. That land had road frontage. A developer had been sniffing around it for years. It was worth something. Mr. Harrison turned a page. "All remaining farm equipment, livestock, and operational assets are to remain with the working farm under Ethan Miller's management." "Remaining equipment," Derek muttered. "You mean the stuff that's falling apart?" Patricia leaned forward. "What about the barn? The old structure on the north side?" Mr. Harrison looked down at the document. "The original barn structure, built in 1951, is bequeathed to Ethan Miller, along with—" He paused, reading carefully. "Everything contained within it." There was a silence. Then Derek laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one. Barn? He said. You're giving him the barn? Lisa put her hand on his arm, but she was smiling too. Patricia shook her head slowly. That thing should have been torn down 20 years ago. It's a liability. One strong wind and it'll collapse on someone. Uncle Gene leaned back in his chair and rubbed his jaw. I wouldn't wish that building on my worst enemy, he said. Half the roof is gone. Whole south wall leans like it's drunk. They all looked at me. Derek with amusement. Patricia with something close to pity. Gene with the blank stare of a man who had already done the math and decided I wasn't worth the investment. Good luck with that, Ethan, Derek said as he stood up, tucking his phone into the breast pocket of his jacket. Maybe you can sell the nails for scrap. They filed out one by one. Nobody shook my hand. Nobody asked how I was doing. Nobody mentioned that I had spent the last 3 years running Dad's farm alone while he got sicker, while the debts piled up, while the price of feed climbed and the price of grain dropped, and the bank sent letters with red stamps on the envelopes. Mr. Harrison waited until the room was empty. Then he looked at me over his glasses again. Your father was very specific about that barn, Ethan, he said quietly. He mentioned it to me twice in the last year, said you'd know what to do with it. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what to do with any of it. The barn stood at the north edge of the property, about 300 yards past the machine shed, at the end of a dirt path that had mostly grown over with thistle and crabgrass. It was the oldest structure on the land, older than the house, older than the grain bins, older than anything. My grandfather had built it in 1951 with hand-cut timbers and iron nails he bought from a hardware store in town that didn't exist anymore. I hadn't been inside in years. Nobody had. The south wall leaned at an angle that made your stomach tighten just looking at it. Half the roof had caved in during a storm in 2019, and a cottonwood tree had pushed through the west corner, its roots cracking the foundation like fingers prying open a fist. The door hung from one hinge. The windows were gone, just dark rectangles that stared at you like hollow eyes. It smelled the way old barns smell, hay dust and mouse droppings and the ghost of motor oil and rain-soaked wood, the kind of smell that sits in the back of your throat and stays there. I went out there the week after the reading. Not because I had a plan, because I had nothing else. The bank was 3 months from foreclosure. The irrigation pump was dying. The truck needed a transmission. I owed money to the feed store, the fuel company, and a veterinarian I hadn't been able to pay since October. The barn was mine now, and if nothing else, I could strip the lumber and sell whatever wasn't rotten. I brought a pry bar, a flashlight, and a pair of work gloves that had more holes than leather. The October sun was low and gold, the way it gets in the valley when the air turns cool, and the fields go quiet after harvest. I could hear a red-tailed hawk somewhere above the tree line. The wind carried the faint smell of turned earth from the neighbor's field. I started with the floorboards. Most of them were warped and split, buckled up from years of moisture and neglect. I figured I'd pull them up, check the joists underneath, and see if any of the wood was worth salvaging. The pry bar bit into the first board with a groan that echoed through the empty space. Dust rose in a column, gold in the light that came through the broken roof. I pulled up 5 boards, then 10. Underneath was packed dirt and gravel, dark with age, scattered with old hay chaff and the brittle husks of dead beetles. Nothing unusual, nothing worth anything. Then, on the 11th board, the pry bar hit something that wasn't wood. It was a dull metallic clang, the sound of iron striking steel. I stopped, brushed away the dirt with my gloved hand. Underneath the board, half buried in compacted earth, was a steel plate, not a pipe, not a bracket, a flat, rectangular steel plate, maybe 3 feet by 2 feet, with a recessed handle welded to its center. A hatch. My heart did something it hadn't done in months. It beat faster. I cleared the rest of the boards around it, swept away decades of dust and hay with my hands until the full outline was visible. The hatch was set into a steel frame that had been bolted into a concrete collar, poured deliberately, cleanly, not part of the original foundation. Someone had installed this on purpose, someone who knew what they were doing. I grabbed the handle with both hands and pulled. Nothing. I braced my boot against the frame, leaned back, and pulled again. The seal broke with a sucking sound, like the barn itself was exhaling a breath it had held for 30 years. Below the hatch was a concrete-lined pit, about 8 feet deep, with a steel ladder bolted to one wall. A repair pit, the kind old-timers used to build under their barns so they could work underneath tractors and heavy equipment without a hydraulic lift. I had seen pictures of them in farming magazines from the 50s, but I had never seen one in person. They were rare even back then. I stood at the top of that ladder for a long time. The air rising from the pit was cool and dry, carrying a smell I recognized instantly: motor oil and concrete dust and the faint metallic tang of old steel. It was the smell of my father's hands when he came in from working late. I had forgotten it. Standing there, leaning over that dark opening, I remembered it all at once, and it hit me like a fist. I climbed down. The air was cool and still, sealed away from the seasons. The beam of my flashlight swept across concrete walls, a wooden workbench built into the far end, and rows of tools hanging on pegboard, wrenches, socket sets, torque bars, all coated in a thin film of dust but otherwise untouched. There were oil cans on the bench, a shop manual with a cracked spine, a tin coffee can full of bolts sorted by size, and in the center of the pit, resting on a pair of heavy steel rails, sat an engine. Not just any engine. A tractor engine. Massive, cast iron, with a displacement that told me it was meant for something far bigger than anything we had ever owned. The block was clean. The heads were sealed with factory precision gaskets. The intake manifold was polished steel, hand-fitted, with welds so smooth they looked like they had been laid down by a machine, not a man. There was no rust, no corrosion. Whoever had put this here had drained every fluid, sealed every opening, and wrapped the exposed surfaces in oiled cloth before closing the hatch. It was preserved like a body in a tomb. I stood there for a long time, the flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to understand what I was looking at. On the workbench, under the shop manual, I found a leather-bound notebook. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with my father's handwriting. Tight, precise, the same handwriting I had seen on feed receipts and veterinary bills my whole life. But these weren't farm records. They were engineering notes, diagrams, measurements, compression ratios, fuel injection specs, page after page of calculations, revisions, and annotations. And next to my father's writing, a second hand, looser, more angular, written in pencil where my father used pen. At the top of the first page, 2 names, Robert Miller and Hank Duvall, Project Leviathan, 1994, Hank Duvall. I knew that name. Everyone in the county knew that name, or used to. Hank was a mechanic. Some people said the best mechanic who ever lived in this part of the state. He had a shop on the edge of town where farmers brought their impossible problems, engines that nobody else could fix, transmissions that dealerships had given up on, machines so old that the parts didn't exist anymore. Hank could fix anything. People said he could hear what was wrong with an engine the way a doctor hears a heartbeat through a stethoscope. I remembered Hank. Not well. I was only a kid. But I remembered him coming to our farm on Saturday mornings. He drove a faded blue Chevy pickup with a toolbox welded into the bed. He and my father would disappear into the machine shed or out behind the barn, and I wouldn't see them for hours. My mother would make lemonade and leave it on the porch step, and sometimes I'd hear them laughing. A rare sound from my father, who wasn't a man who laughed easily. I never thought to ask what they were working on. I was 7, 8 years old. I was catching frogs in the drainage ditch and throwing rocks at fence posts. The adult world was a closed door I hadn't learned to open yet. Then, sometime around 1997, Hank closed his shop, sold his house, and disappeared. No forwarding address, no explanation. People talked about it for years. Some said he moved to Montana. Some said he went to work for a company out west. Some said he just got tired of Greece and small towns. Nobody knew for sure. He became one of those local legends that fades into rumor. But here, in this pit, was proof that before Hank left, he and my father had built something together, something they never told anyone about. I spent the next 3 weeks in that pit. Every morning before dawn, I climbed down the ladder with a thermos of coffee and a trouble light, and I didn't come back up until the sun was low. I went through the notebook page by page. I studied the engine from every angle. I began to understand what they had built. It was a prototype, a high-torque, low RPM diesel engine designed specifically for heavy field work, plowing, disking, pulling loaded grain carts through wet ground. The engineering was unconventional. Where factory engines used standard bore spacing, my father and Hank had widened the cylinders and shortened the stroke, creating a torque curve that peaked at almost impossibly low revolutions. The fuel system was hand-built, a mechanical injection setup that bypassed the electronic controls that were just starting to appear on tractors in the 90s. It was analog, it was simple. And according to the numbers in the notebook, it produced nearly twice the pulling power of any production engine in its class. There were notes about testing, late-night entries in my father's handwriting, times, temperatures, fuel consumption figures, torque readings taken with a dynamometer they had apparently borrowed from a machine shop in the next county. And there were notes about secrecy. My father had written, in capital letters on one page, "Do not tell anyone until it is ready." But it was never ready. The last entries in the notebook were from March 1997, the same month Hank disappeared. The final page had only one line in my father's hand. "Hank is gone. I will. Keep it safe." And he did. For almost 30 years, my father kept that engine sealed under the barn, told nobody, and took the secret to his grave. At first, when I tried to explain what I had found, nobody believed me. Derek called it another one of Ethan's projects. Like the time I tried to rebuild the grain dryer, or the time I thought I could fix the combine myself. Patricia said I was wasting time I didn't have, chasing ghosts in a collapsing building while the bank was breathing down my neck. Even the neighbors were skeptical. Tom Waller, who farmed the section east of ours, came over one afternoon and looked down into the pit with his arms crossed. "That's a nice-looking engine block," he said, "but nice-looking don't pay the mortgage." I didn't argue with any of them. I just kept working. I cleaned the engine, I replaced the seals, I sourced fluids, oil, coolant, diesel, and filled each system according to the specs in the notebook. I rebuilt the fuel injectors at the kitchen table, working under a lamp with my father's notes spread around me like a map. Some nights I sat there until 2 or 3 in the morning, holding a tiny brass nozzle under a magnifying glass, comparing it to the diagram on the page, adjusting the spray angle with a jeweler's file, because that was the only tool small enough to do it right. I fabricated a new wiring harness from scratch, because the original had been chewed through by mice at some point in the last 3 decades. I drove 40 miles to a salvage yard in Redfield to find copper wire of the right gauge. The man behind the counter looked at the spec sheet I'd copied from the notebook, looked at me, and said, "What the hell are you building?" I told him I didn't know yet. That was still the truth. The hardest part was the cooling system. My father and Hank had designed a custom radiator with a dual pass flow that didn't match any standard fittings. I had to braze new connections from copper, tubing, working with a torch in the pit, the blue flame throwing wild shadows on the concrete walls. I burned my forearm twice. I didn't notice either time until I came up for air and saw the blisters. During those weeks, the farm didn't stop needing me. I still had cattle to feed and fences to mend and a broken auger to wrestle with. I still checked the mailbox every day with a knot in my stomach, sorting bills from warnings from threats. The bank sent a letter with the word "Final" stamped across the top. I folded it and put it in the kitchen drawer with the others. But every spare hour, before dawn, after dark, Sunday mornings when the rest of the world was sleeping, I was down in that pit. It took me 6 weeks. 6 weeks of sleeping 4 hours a night, skipping meals, ignoring the phone when the bank called. 6 weeks of talking to an engine like it was a person, coaxing it, studying it, learning the logic of 2 men who had poured years of thought into something nobody else ever saw. The morning I turned the key was a Tuesday in late November. The air was sharp and cold. Frost on the fields, my breath hanging in clouds. I had rigged a temporary fuel line and a battery from the truck. I sat on an overturned bucket next to the engine, turned the ignition switch my father had wired into the test panel, and waited. The starter groaned. The engine turned once, coughed, and went silent. I adjusted the timing by 2 degrees, the way the notebook said. Tried again. This time, the engine caught. It rumbled to life with a sound I had never heard before. Deep, low even, like thunder rolling slowly across flat ground. The concrete walls of the pit vibrated. The tools on the pegboard rattled against their hooks. The coffee in my thermos rippled. It didn't roar, it didn't scream. It just ran, steady and powerful, the way a river runs, the way something unstoppable runs. I could feel it in my chest, in my teeth, in the soles of my boots against the concrete floor. 2 men had built this sound. 2 men in a pit under a barn, working by lamplight, dreaming of something bigger than themselves. And now, 30 years later, it was alive. I sat on that bucket with my hands shaking and my eyes burning, and listened to the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I let it run for 10 minutes, then 20. I adjusted the idle mixture the way the notebook described. The RPMs settled into a rhythm so smooth it sounded like breathing. When I finally turned it off, the silence that followed was enormous. It filled the pit like water. And in that silence, for the first time since my father died, I felt something that wasn't grief or exhaustion or fear. I felt hope. Word got out the way things do in a small town. Slowly at first, then all at once. Tom Waller heard the engine running from his field and came over to see what I was doing. He stood at the edge of the pit, looked down, and didn't say anything for a full minute. Then he said, "That's not a factory block." Within a week, 3 more neighbors had come by. Then, a retired mechanic from 2 towns over named Gus Prentice, who was 81 years old and had known Hank Duval personally. Gus climbed down the ladder, slowly, one careful rung at a time, and walked around the engine with his hands behind his back, the way you walk around something sacred. I knew Hank was building something, Gus said quietly. He talked about it once, maybe twice. Said he and a farmer were working on an engine that would change fieldwork forever. He called it, what was it? Leviathan, I said. Gus looked at me with wet eyes. That's the one. People used to say it was the most powerful tractor engine never sold. I always figured it was just talk. He put his hand on the engine block, gently, the way you'd touch a horse's neck. It wasn't talk. A professor of agricultural engineering from the state university drove out after Gus told someone who told someone who told someone. She spent 2 hours in the pit, photographing the engine, reading the notebook, measuring bore diameters, and checking tolerances. When she came back up, her face had the expression of someone who had just found a first edition book in a yard sale bin. "This is extraordinary," she said. "The design philosophy is 30 years ahead of when it was built. Some of these solutions, the torque multiplication, the thermal management, manufacturers didn't adopt them until 2015 or later. Your father and Mr. Duval were building the future in a barn." She asked if she could write about it. I said yes. She asked if the university could study the engine. I said yes to that too. She asked if I had any idea what it was worth, and I told her I didn't care what it was worth. I cared that it worked. What happened next happened fast. The university published a paper. A regional farming magazine ran a story. Then a national one. Then 3 collectors called within the same week, asking if I was willing to sell the engine. I wasn't. But a manufacturing company, a real one, with factories and engineers and money, read the paper and flew 2 representatives to my kitchen table. They didn't want to buy the engine. They wanted to license the design. The fuel injection system alone, they said, had applications in modern low-emission diesel platforms. The torque curve my father and Hank had achieved was something their own R&D team had been trying to replicate for years. They offered a licensing agreement. I won't say the exact number because it doesn't matter as much as what it meant. What it meant was that the bank stopped calling. What it meant was that I could fix the irrigation pump and rebuild the machine shed and buy feed without checking my account balance first. What it meant was that for the first time in 3 years, I walked into the feed store and paid my tab in full, and old Mrs. Harmon looked at me over the counter with her reading glasses on, the tip of her nose, and said, "Your daddy would be proud of you, Ethan." And I had to look away because I couldn't speak. I used part of the money to shore up the barn. Not tear it down, shore it up. I hired a crew to straighten the south wall, replace the missing roof sections, and pour a new slab around the hatch. I kept the pit exactly as I found it, tools and all. The university asked if they could install a plaque by the entrance. I said yes, as long as it had both names on it, Robert Miller and Hank Duval. 6 months later, a woman contacted me through the university. Her name was Claire Duval. She was Hank's daughter. She lived in Bozeman, Montana, where Hank had moved in 1997. He had died in 2019. Quietly, without fanfare, running a small repair shop out of his garage. He never talked about the engine. He never told his family what he and my father had built. Claire drove out to see the barn. She stood in the pit for 20 minutes, touching the engine, reading the notebook, tracing her father's handwriting with her fingertip. When she came back up, her eyes were red, and she held my hand with both of hers and said, Thank you for not letting it disappear. I told her I almost did. I told her everyone told me to. She smiled. That's what they told my dad too. What it meant was that the farm survived. But that wasn't the part that mattered most. The part that mattered most was the last page of the notebook, the one I didn't find until weeks later, when I was cataloging everything for the university. It was stuck to the inside of the back cover, a single sheet of lined paper folded in half. My father's handwriting, but shakier than the rest. Written recently, maybe in the last year of his life. It said, "Ethan, I know you think I left you nothing but problems. I know the farm has been hard on you, and I'm sorry I couldn't make it easier. But I couldn't tell you about this while I was alive. If I told you, you would have tried to sell it, and it would have ended up in a warehouse somewhere, forgotten. I needed you to find it yourself. I needed you to understand what it was before you decided what to do with it. Hank and I spent 4 years building this engine. It was the best work either of us ever did. We believed it could change things for farmers like us, people who couldn't afford the newest machines but still had to feed the world. Hank left because he got scared. He thought nobody would ever take it seriously. 2 guys in a barn with a crazy idea. I stayed because I believed in it. I just ran out of time. You won't run out of time. You're stronger than me, and you're stronger than Hank. You've kept this place alive when anyone else would have walked away. That's how I know you're the right person for this. Don't let them tell you the barn was nothing. The barn was everything. I love you, son. Dad." I read that letter sitting on the floor of the pit with the engine cold and silent beside me. And I cried the way I couldn't cry at the funeral. Deep, shaking sobs that echoed off the concrete walls and came back to me like the barn itself was holding me. He hadn't left me a ruin. He had left me a workshop, a blueprint, a piece of history, and a second chance. He had left me the proof that 2 ordinary men with calloused hands and a dream could build something that the rest of the world would eventually need. He had left me Leviathan. And in the end, I didn't just restore an engine. I uncovered my father's last secret. I brought a forgotten legend back to life, and I learned something that no bank statement or land deed could ever teach me. The most valuable things don't always look like treasures. Sometimes they look like rotten floorboards in a half-collapsed barn that everyone says you should tear down. Sometimes the inheritance that looks like nothing is the one that turns out to be everything.